Cnoc, Montpelier. It was dark and it was raining. The ruins of the former Hellfire Club sat at the top of Cnoc, Montpelier in the Dublin Mountains, overlooking the city. The little light that there was came from the few stars that weren't obscured by the clouds and the pollution from the distant streets. The building itself was built from mud and red brick, cemented together with some long-forgotten recipe and weathered by the elements until it looked like it had sprung out of the ground. The walls were dotted with windows, some small squares, a couple of large rectangles, and an imposing archway on the opposite wall to the entrance, though the glass had long since disappeared, blown out in storms that no living soul could still remember, though they'd been passed down in the stories told over fireplaces on cold winter nights. It was the perfect building for the desolate spot amongst the grassland atop the mountains, and it had a history as old as anything that the city itself had to offer. Perhaps it was just a myth or a legend, but if it was, then it was the best kind of myth or legend, the kind that has at least a passing acquaintance with historical reality. Whatever the case, the old-timers with a connection to the land said that it dated back to the Neolithic period, making it as much as 6,500 years old. Bristol Paul, one of the local pissheads who'd earned the nickname because he'd once spent a summer across the sea and the locals had never let him live it down, liked to say, "The ruins were ruins long before the Celts were Celts, and they'll still be there long after we've gone. They're a piece of our history, our culture. Even the fuckers from the British Army couldn't destroy them." To which one of the other pissheads would inevitably ask, "How can you ruin ruins?" The truth was that no one, not even Bristol Paul, knew the real story of the ruins. Most people thought that it had started out as some sort of tomb, but that was just a guess, a ghost story to be told over the dying embers of campfires or at sleepovers where kids stayed up late and switched to whispering stories when their parents went to bed and the Xbox would have made too much noise. Over the centuries, the tomb was repurposed, becoming a shelter of sorts for weary travellers in the winter months, when it was too dark to press onto the city until the following morning. It also developed a reputation as a haunt for outlaws, those who couldn't enter the city limits without the Gardae taken after them. It was a reputation that lasted until long past the Second World War. But our story takes place long before that, in the middle of the 18th century. It was a period of uncertainty and uneasiness. The English had taken over the land and imposed harsh laws on Irish Catholics, which meant the majority of the country's population. For the locals, it was the opening salvo in a war of the people that threatened to eventually spill over into genocide. But in Dublin, there was a thriving Protestant community, the members of which were only too happy to see their Catholic counterparts being prevented from taking public office or serving in the armed services. New Catholic churches were almost unheard of, and those that were built were made of wood and away from the main roads. The new laws hadn't done much damage to the city, which was still growing at an alarming rate. It was said that Dublin was the second biggest city in the British Empire, with only London having more people on its storied streets. The city had started the century looking like the Paris of Europe, especially from above, with a similar layout and plenty of picturesque and impractical medieval buildings. As the century progressed, work had been carried out to modernise the city, with a number of notable buildings springing up almost overnight, their Georgian facades in stark contrast to the rest of the city. The city had been shaped by Lieutenant General James Fitz-Thomas Butler, 1st Duke of Ormond and Lord Deputy of Ireland, who'd been the first to give orders to bring the city from the past into the present. Butler had ordered that any houses built along the River Liffey would need to be built facing the river, and their facades would have to be designed with aesthetics in mind. It made the river more of a focus, transforming it from little more than a dumping ground into a living, breathing organism of its own. It took a few decades and a lot of clean-up work to stop it from stinking like a cesspit, though. Even despite all of the building and the cleaning, the city remained a work in progress. There were parts of Dublin where it was unwise to venture alone at night and where women and children weren't even safe in the daytime. The slums just kept growing, mainly because the rural folk moving in from the countryside couldn't afford to live anywhere nicer. The slums were mostly to the north and the southwest, and those who could afford to avoid them did exactly that. There were good reasons for that. The streets were roamed by gangs like the Liberty Boys and the Ormond Boys, groups of urchins and miscreants who gathered together based on a shared region or religion. The gangs kept themselves to themselves when they could, because on those occasions when they did clash together, it always ended with blood running through the street. From time to time, the sun would rise on a body in the gutter, but they were gutter kids who often had no one to miss them. They were usually carted away and buried in an unmarked grave somewhere with nowhere to mourn them. Riots weren't uncommon, especially when there were controversies around new laws. When people weren't poor, they were mad. When he died in 1745, Gulliver's Travels author Jonathan Swift left his entire estate to be spent building a hospital for the fools and the mad. The following year, King George II awarded a royal charter to St Patrick's Hospital, which became the first psychiatric hospital to be built in Ireland. It's one of the oldest such facilities in the world, and is still one of the country's leading mental health hospitals to this day. Swift had previously penned a modest proposal, an ironic and satirical piece that suggested that the Irish poor could make a little cash by selling their children to the rich for food. If he'd lived 300 years later and been born in the United States, he could have been president. It was against this backdrop that the building atop Cnoc, Montpelier was built. It started life as a summer residence and hunting lodge, which was christened Montpelier, and which eventually gave the hill its name. The locals spoke in whispered murmurings of the brass castle at the top of Bevan's Hill, but its original name is as lost to antiquity as the names of the ancients who first built their tombs there. The lodge was built by William Connolly, an Irish politician who served as Speaker of the Irish House of Commons for nearly 15 years until his death in 1729. After his death, ownership of the brass castle was passed through several pairs of hands until it ended up with the Hellfire Club. By then, the brass castle already had something of a bad reputation. During its construction, stones had been taken from the ancient cairn and used to bolster the building. Then, when the building was finally finished, a storm hit the hillside and blew the roof off, exposing Connolly's lodge to the elements. The wind and rain ransacked the building as efficiently as any rioters could have done, but the real damage was to its reputation. It started with the whispers and the murmurings that passed from one Irish peasant to another over a pint or two of homebrew. It was the devil at work that night. Connolly should have known better than to have messed with the ruins. The whole lodge is a fool's errand. They knew what they were doing when they built the thing. They'll get what's coming to them. But the storm was only the start. Before long, the brass castle had earned a reputation for the supernatural and the paranormal, a reputation that continued to grow after Connolly's death, when his former lodge became the home of the Hellfire Club. Like so many mysteries from the time, it was unclear how and why the club took ownership of the lodge, and there were few who believed that the straight-laced Speaker Connolly had been a member. The club was known for its drunkenness and debauchery, but so was half of Dublin. However, even the poor drunks in the slums still showed up for Sunday Mass. The same couldn't be said for the members of the Hellfire Club. They were devout enough, but not in service of the Catholic God. Instead, they served the devil, carrying out their occult rituals and satanic services at the top of Cnoc, Montpelier under cover of darkness. Before long, the building at the top of the hill was no longer known as Montpelier or the Brass Castle. It was known as the Hellfire Club. The rumours continued to pick up steam, helped by a mysterious fire that engulfed the southern wing one night, only to burn itself out as quickly as it started. The home of the Hellfire Club moved briefly to Steward's house while the building was repaired, but it didn't take long. Once again, the locals said that no mere mortals could have repaired the building that quickly. They must have had help from the devil. That would also explain the huge black cat that had moved into the building while the repairs were being carried out. Even after the members of the Hellfire Club restarted their meetings within its walls, the cat continued to live there, adopted as a sort of unofficial mascot and fed richly with the scraps of meat that were left over from the unholy banquets. Time moved on, as it tends to do, and the summers turned into winters and then back into summers again. One night, when the winter winds were at their worst and few people were about even on the relatively isolated streets of the city, there was a knock at the door. Each rap of the fist was like the pounding of cannon fire, shaking the thick oak door in its frame and rattling the windows, which were already struggling to hold their own against the howling of the wind and the heavy rain. There were 6 men inside, each of them a member of the Hellfire Club. Sir Patrick O'Connell was a professional landowner, a man who'd built his fortune on the backs of the poor and who was known for his love of whiskey. James Burke was a barrister and member of Parliament who had a reputation for being incorruptible, mostly because his constituents had never seen him inside the Brass Castle. John Hamilton was a wealthy merchant and philanthropist who'd been born in the slums and worked his way up to a position at the height of society, although his working-class mannerisms often betrayed him. William Plunkett was a military officer who'd been introduced to the society by the 5th guest, who was Lord Anthony Leary of the British Army. Their final guest was wine merchant Arthur Fitzgerald, and it was Arthur who'd insisted on playing a game or two of cards. They were midway through a hand when they'd heard the knock at the door. The 6 men looked around at one another, and Plunkett drew the metaphorical short straw and went to open the door. When he did so, the wind ripped through the room and blew out the candles, sending their cards scattering to the floor. The only light that remained came from the fireplace, where logs and coals were crackling merrily away and providing the room with enough heat to stop them from freezing. "Good evening, gentlemen," their visitor said. "I hope I'm not intruding." The man moved forward, and Plunkett stepped aside and then drew the door closed before pulling the heavy iron bolt across to secure it. In the meantime, Sir Patrick and Lord Leary were relighting the candles, first holding them into the fireplace and then using one blazing wick to light another. All 6 pairs of eyes turned to look at the newcomer, who was dressed in a fashionable suit and a stylish hat. His long locks of golden hair were clumped together from the rain, and his deep blue eyes looked out piercingly at the 6 men of the Hellfire Club. A faint smile played across his lips. Fitzgerald was the first man to regain his composure. "Not at all, my good man," he said. Come in. Sit by the fire a while. We'll make sure that you're fed and watered soon enough. Who do we have the pleasure of speaking to?" "My name is Charles McGinnis," the stranger said, "and I thank you for your hospitality. Please don't trouble yourself on my account. I need no food or wine, just a little shelter while we wait for the storm to pass. And perhaps you could deal me a hand in your game of poker." "How did you—" Fitzgerald began. Then he shrugged his shoulders. "Of course, please take a seat." His fellow card players finished relighting the candles, and the 7 men took up seats around the table. McGinnis produced a pipe from within the inner pocket of his suit, tapped it thoughtfully against the table, and then lit the tobacco inside with one of the candles. Fitzgerald finished dealing the next hand, and the game began. The 6 men of the Hellfire Club were relatively wealthy, especially for the time, but the stranger seemed to have deeper pockets than the rest of them combined. Before his arrival, they'd been playing for pittances, just whiling away the time. Afterwards, they found themselves playing for serious sums of money, more money, in fact, than any of them was carrying. "Now, I trust you gentlemen to your word," McGinnis said, as he won another hand. "I'll visit you soon enough to collect what you owe me." "That's if we don't win it back," Plunkett growled. He looked as though he wanted to withdraw a revolver and put a bullet in McGinnis's head. "Well, we'll see." "Damn it," Fitzgerald said, slamming his fist to the table and sending his cards scattering to the floor. "Gentlemen, please, let's save the arguments for after the game is over." Then he pushed his chair backwards, its wood screeching unpleasantly against the stone floor, and bent down to retrieve his cards. When he surfaced again, the colour had drained from his face. "Your feet," Fitzgerald said. "They're—" "Hooves," McGinnis replied. "Yes." He sighed and stood up, pushing himself back from the table. When he'd entered the room, there had been little light, and the card players had been looking at his face. This time, all 6 pairs of eyes turned to stare at his feet, which were just like the man had said. He had the cloven hooves of a beast, not the fleshy toes of a man. "Alas," McGinnis said, "I was hoping to keep my secret until the dawn. I'm not known for my love of the cold weather. In fact, I'm rather fond of the heat." What happened next is a matter of dispute. The facts show that only one of the 6 men, James Burke, survived the fire that ripped through the hunting lodge and burned it to ashes, leaving only the shell that still stands at the top of Montpelier. Burke was found wandering in the snow the following morning when a group of men from the town climbed the hill to investigate the thick smoke that had blown over from the hill and settled above the city. His clothes were singed and his flesh was burned, but the real damage had been done to the man's mind. He told his rescuers a bizarre tale about a mysterious man with cloven hooves, but when pressed to talk about the fire, his eyes filled with terror and his voice died in his throat. He was taken to St. Patrick's Hospital, where he lived out the rest of his days as a patient. He never fully recovered. As for the rescue party, it was just another day in Dublin. The fire was ruled as accidental, though that was far from what the gossip said. And as the rescuers chatted to their friends in the dingy pubs, they occasionally retold the tale that Burke had shared, adding one final disturbing detail. When they'd arrived at the brass castle, several of the men had spotted a set of hoofprints in the melting snow, leading away from the blazing building and towards the busy city.